Hello, today I'm gonna be making a magical levitating rock island garden thing or something like that. And it's based off an adventure called Oraklets fyra ögon, or as it would be called in English, The Four Eyes of the Oracle. It's an adventure that was released in 1990 for the Swedish tabletop RPG Drakar och Demoner, written by the author Erik Granström. It's an adventure that holds a very special place in my heart. And just to be clear, this video will contain a fair amount of spoilers, so if you're planning on playing this adventure, then I recommend that you watch this entire video and just don't tell your DM about it. So the plot of this part of the adventure is to rescue or perhaps kidnap a child, depending on how you want to look at it. And the child in question lives on this levitating rock, which isn't really levitating, but more on that later. Anywho, on top of the rock there are a couple of structures that make up a little garden of sorts. And you might be thinking, what if the child just fell off the edge? Well, that's where this little XPS foam wall comes in and saves the day. And once cleft in twain, I poked some rocky textures onto the outside of the wall with a crumpled up piece of aluminum foil. Then gluing the walls in place around the edge of the rock using some hot glue, making sure that no blue child falls to its death. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that the child is blue. Not like feeling blue, I mean it's actually blue. Don't ask me why, cause I don't know. At the center of the rock surface there is a little gazebo standing on top of the hill. And that was the first structure that I started to make, following an illustration from the book as a reference. To create the railing of the gazebo I used this metal mesh, but as a result of that I'll henceforth be using tea bags when drinking my tea, I guess. But that's life. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a little to create art or perhaps a YouTube video. Anyways, I proceeded to add all the remaining fiddly-diddly details until I was happy with how the gazebo was looking. It turned out a little crooked here and there, but that was totally on purpose. As previously mentioned, the gazebo was standing on top of a hill, so I made a hill out of some XPS foam, as well as giving it a little door that leads to the room where the blue child sleeps. And then I glued the entire thing in place in the center of the rock, before adding a couple of mounts by the side of the hill. I also added some thin foam pieces here and there that will make the ground look a bit more uneven once painted and covered with grass and stuff. Then I made the building that you pass through when you enter the garden. It's a pretty simple square stone structure, or XPS foam structure in this case. And just like with the gazebo and basically everything else in this entire build, I would rely on the only illustration in the book showing the buildings as a reference. I realized that gluing the buildings onto the base before painting them wasn't the smartest idea. However, I realized that when this building had already been glued in place. But oh well, no more gluing buildings in place after this one. I know what you might be thinking, how do you enter this levitating rock? Well, as you can see, there's a little underground passage that leads up into the square building. And I have no idea if you were actually wondering about that, but you're welcome. And with that nugget of information out of the way, let's make a pavilion. According to the description of the pavilion, it has wooden walls that can be opened and closed, and I wasn't entirely sure on how to make something like that look good. The only picture available didn't offer much advice either, but I'm kind of happy with my design. I de-ragtagged a little piece of real fabric I would use to create the circus tent vibe that the pavilion's roof has going on. And to make sure the fabric wouldn't be flopping around all over the place, I dabbed it with some watered down PVA glue before adding some ornaments on top of the tent roof, or whatever it's called. Does a tent have a roof, or is the tent a roof? I don't know. Of course, the blue child isn't the only one living on the levitating rock. That would be very irresponsible. No, there's actually a girl taking care of the blue child and she lives in a small and simple house. So I made a small and simple house and gave the roof some strange looking details, just like the one featured in the illustration. The final building to make was an aviary, so I started by tracing a row of arches on a small piece of plastic card before cutting them out to make a line of 6 arc-shaped openings. Then I dribbled on some super glue so I could attach a little piece of aluminum wire. That way I would be able to bend the outside of the aviary into the correct shape and make sure that it lines up against the wall appropriately. I used the same metal mesh material I'd previously used on the gazebo to cover up the entire enclosure, and with the aviary complete, then all of the buildings were done. So I proceeded to poke away some foam within the squiggly lines that would become a pond, which in turn is connected to a little stream, creating a waterfall from underneath the rock. And the water that falls is considered holy water, blessed by the innocent child. And to give some more context, the child itself is looked upon as this holy oracle that's being kept away from all the evil in the world, therefore retaining its innocence and being seen as like a symbol of purity, because the city where this levitating rock is at is a little bit of a shithole, where pretty much everyone is a zombified drug addict. So the innocent child is seen as like a beacon of light within an otherwise quite poopy existence. How about that? Alright, next up it's time to make something for the rock to levitate on. Our levitating rock island garden thing is seemingly floating in the air above a temple that looks like a pyramid consisting of 3 levels. But the island isn't actually levitating, but instead being held up by an invisible genie, or an ifrit as it's referred to in the book. And the ifrit is bound to its duty of holding up the island by a magical teeny-weeny silver string that can be severed to release the ifrit, which most likely will lead to it crashing the rock straight into the temple, and everybody dies. Fantasy. You gotta love it. Not only did I manage to cut the angle of the lowest level incredibly uneven, but I also realized when consulting with this little dude I was using as a reference for scale that the pyramid was unfortunately turning out way too big. So I made another pyramid that was a little bit smaller off camera before continuing on. Next it was time to make some stairs leading up to each of the individual levels of the pyramid. And the best idea I had of making the stairs was to cut out each of the steps individually from a block of XPS foam. But surprise, surprise, that wasn't the best idea, but more like the worst idea. So I scrapped that idea and remembered that I actually had some thin foam material that just so happened to be the perfect thickness. And once cut to correct size, I just glued them together on top of each other to create the main shape of the stair. Then it was just a question of making sure I got the angles right and cutting away all the excess foam to reshape them to have a little bit more of a tapered look. I repeated the process and made 2 more smaller stairs before gluing them as well as the first 2 levels of the pyramid in place. The lower part of the pyramid would have the look of being comprised of smaller rectangular stone blocks, so I used the same material I previously used for the stairs to make said stone blocks. And you better believe that snapping off those rectangles was quite satisfying. Then I started to glue all the rectangles onto the pyramid in a brick pattern and cut away all the parts sticking out too far before continuing with each new side. And when all the rectangles were in place, I gave them a little texturizing with my crumpled up piece of aluminum foil. Alright, time for the final part of the pyramid, and as you can see I've dug out a little hole in it. But why? Well, the levitating rock is connected to the pyramid with a chain, a really big chain. And I knew that trying to build or sculpt that chain myself would be a pain in the ass. And unfortunately, I don't have a 3D printer, but what I do have is something much better. A brother with a 3D printer. So thank you, brother, for helping me, your brother with a chain. And I totally didn't drop the chain on the ground, breaking it and having to glue it back together. Then I glued the chain onto the top part of the pyramid, as well as connecting the other end to a circular piece of XPS foam. And that part would become a room that's located underneath the rock, where the blue child sleeps. The only thing that would identify it as being a room are the 4 windows in each direction that shows an altered version of reality when looking out of them. When the top part of the pyramid had been glued into place, as well as the final staircase, then I added some snabb torkande spackel to the pyramid, and once it had dried I gave it a good old sanding. I attached a little door as an entrance to the pyramid before gluing on some details that looks like incredibly goofy snakes in the illustrated version, but I decided to pass on the goofy snake look and just add some horns or something like that. Alright, so then I was done building the temple and the floating rock, and you know what time it is. It is time to paint. Since the color of the pyramid is left out of the description in the book, I had to make a decision like a grown-up person, which I did, and decided to paint the pyramid in a light beige-brown color. I wouldn't exactly say that the temple is the star of the show in this build. I look at it as a little bit more of an elaborate stand for the floating island, but I wanted to stay true to some of the details actually described in the book. One of them being that once every 3 months the high priest of the temple climbs all the way up the pyramid and paints the chain blue as far as he can reach, since blue is the color of innocence. So I painted on a little bit of blue color onto the last link of the chain, and then the temple was done and it's time to paint the island. I started off by base coating the ground as well as all of the rocky parts of the island, before giving the rocky parts a couple of different layers of highlight. The wall around the island was given a yellowy base coat, as well as a healthy amount of highlights with an off-white color. I realized I'd forgot to add the sand at the bottom of the pond before I started to paint, so I sprinkled on a little bit of sand here and there, and as I was waiting on that to dry, I continued to paint some of the buildings on the island. And I wanted the buildings to have a bit of a unified look, so I figured since the color blue is kind of an overarching theme, I would paint the roof of the gazebo and the pavilion blue. And I also painted all of the metallic parts of the build with a deep copper color. I painted up the bottom of the pond with a couple of layers of grey, and safe to say I had some issues with the pond, but more on that later. Once the house that belongs to the caretaker had been painted, as well as the blue child's wishing well I made off camera, then they were both glued in place and it was time to add some greenery to the scenery. I used my static grass applicator to apply some 2 and 3 mm grass, and I feel like it's almost unnecessary to use an applicator on grass that short. But I have paid good money for this applicator, so I'm gonna use it. You better believe I'm gonna use it. When I was done vacuuming the table, I proceeded to add some details to the ground beneath the aviary, and I had hoped that you would be able to see through the metal mesh a bit better, but well, it would appear that I have wasted the 2 minutes of my life putting dirt and sticks on ground. But such is life of an artiste, wasting time for no money. I made a couple of cute little trees, and together they will form what the book calls a monkey forest. And in that forest lives koala bears, apparently. And my knowledge about animals might be mediocre at best, but I'm pretty sure that koala bears isn't monkeys. I added some brown and green flock all around the island to cover the seam between the ground and the wall, as well as adding some extra dirt on the rock itself. And I gotta say, this is starting to look like a quite delightful little garden. But it's time to add some water. This is the first time that I've ever used a water effect like this one, and the bottle said to apply in several fine layers of no more than 3 mm or else cracks may occur. But I figured since the pond was only 9 mm deep, I didn't think those extra 6 mm would matter. Take a guess on who was wrong. That's right, me. I was wrong. And after waiting 24 hours, it was time to assess the damage. So not only did the water effect seep into the static grass, but oh my lord, if those aren't the biggest cracks you've ever seen. But without panicking too much, I filled up the cracks with some more water effects and waited another 24 hours. And it didn't turn out perfect, but it looked okay. So then I decided to apply some PVA glue to create some more ripples. And long story short, when the PVA glue had dried, I added some more water effects, which made the water look like this for about 54 hours. Safe to say I was a little bit upset that my pond had turned into a sea. Man. But after about 24 more hours, the pond was starting to look a little bit more transparent. And after an additional 24 hours, the pond was starting to look like this. Oh well, unfortunately I think I'll have to live with the pond looking a bit milky. But I could at least cover up some of the worst cracks and bubbles with some water lilies. But you know what? Life could be worse. Anyways, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you liked it. And until the next time, be kind to yourself and others around you. And I will see you again really soon. Here are the final results.